Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to round 4 coverage of my games from the 2018 Oregon Open. Round 4 was played Sunday evening starting at 6. Round 3 had been played at Sunday morning at 10 a.m. So there was a longer than usual gap between round 3 and round 4. And the purpose of that was so that the Oregon State Chess Association could have their annual meeting. So, but that gave me a nice break between rounds to go for a hike and clear my head a little bit. So I went and did that, and then I came back for round 4. I had the white pieces, and my opponent was another youngster, but this time he was one of the older. He was one of the big kids and not one of the little kids. Anyway, I start off with d4. He played knight f6. Went with c4, he goes e6, so I'm thinking he wants to play a Nimzo Indian, play knight c3, and instead of going for the Nimzo, he plays d5, which is a very respectable alternative. Of course, this is just the queen's gambit declined. So I continue with knight f3, that's the main move. He goes bishop e7. So I think for a while, a lot of times I just play the move e3. It allows this bishop to defend the pawn. But that pawn doesn't really need defense at the moment. If it gets taken, there's always this, queen check and take it back. So I'm not in any hurry to defend that pawn, and it's an opportunity for me to get the bishop outside the pawn chain. So I went ahead and played bishop g5, which is in fact the main move in this position. He castled. Play e3 now, and then he went b6. So this is the Tartakower variation. Actually, b6 right here is a bit of a rarity. The main way it's played, and this is known as the Tartakower Makaganov-Bondarevsky variation, one of the longest names in chess for a variation. The way it's normally played is h6 first, kicking the bishop back, and then b6. And I'm not sure entirely what the point of this little move order wrinkle is. Maybe it's in some lines that I didn't look at. But I looked at different variations, and the chess engine thinks this is not all that much different from just going immediately b6 the way my opponent played. My understanding of the history was that this b6 move was Tartakower's way of playing, and then Makaganov and Bondarevsky started playing this h6 move first and then going for b6. And so it's a slight improvement, but I couldn't say for sure what exactly the purpose of that improvement is, in what way it improves the situation. Anyway, I continued here with bishop d3, which is actually not the main move. I was somehow a little bit confused by my opponent's move order, maybe because he started off with a Nimzo Indian, or maybe just because he's playing this immediate b6 rather than kicking the bishop first. But the main move here is to take the pawn. And the idea is that black normally takes with the pawn, but even if he takes with the knight, let's see, you can take back like this, and typically queen takes, knight takes, pawn takes is how it goes, and you still end up with a pawn here. I guess there is some line in which the knight could take back here. But, well, this gives white pretty good pawns in the center here. Maybe white can push on with e4 and d5 or something like that. Anyway, the point is that in most lines there is a pawn on d5 at the end of this, and because because b6 has been played, bishop to b7 is the logical follow-on. And you're putting this pawn here to make it more difficult for that bishop to enter the game. Now you can continue. In fact, it's another line to continue with. Let's see. He just took, so I have to put a move in. Say I play bishop d3. It is also a line to continue with bishop to e6 and just give up the idea of putting the bishop there. But often black will still play with the bishop here, and the idea is to push the c-pawn forward and kind of open things up that way. In any case, these are all very solid variations for black, and they've been played a lot at the top level. But pawn takes is the main move there, and I'm playing it a bit of a peculiar fashion with the bishop to d3. This lets black equalize pretty easily, I guess. Now let's see. So he continues with bishop to b7. I castle. He goes knight bd7, getting his other knight into the game, and I go b3. So I thought, well, if he takes, I will take back, and I will just have a slightly bigger center than he does. And since I didn't take the opportunity to exchange on d5 when I had the chance, there's not as much of a point to it here, because now in this position, black can keep taking back with pieces. He's got both the knight and the bishop defending it. The chess engine here suggests a couple of alternatives. Well, also the opening book. This is still a position that's in the opening book too. I haven't gone out of the book yet. Rook to c1 is a move here, and queen to e2 is a move here. Maybe preparing for some kind of e-pawn push at some point, and trying to shut down the bishop on this diagonal. So b3 is out of book, and now we're all on our own. And like I say, I think black is equalized here. Plays this move knight e4. That's a good move, just provoking this exchange. It sometimes simplifies black's defensive tasks in these queen's gambit decline positions where he's a little bit cramped. Trading some pieces can help. Let's see, I go rook c1 here, and he goes c5. He could have, actually, instead of c5, he could have taken my knight off. I think that's the chess engine recommendation. And, I have to take back with the rook. And I think black is doing fine here as well, and maybe hoping to, maybe my pieces are a little bit oddly placed at the moment, but should also be fine for white. So all these moves keep the game in the range of about even. He went c5 here, and I think that also is pretty typical of this position. And I can leave the tension here, but then that sort of gives black the option of choosing which way he wants to open things up. So I generally like to, when the tension reaches this point, I generally like to look at it and figure out the best way to try and exchange and go for that. If there is no good way to exchange, then of course you can always play a piece move. But I think taking c takes d5 is often the right answer here. You're trying to trade a wing pawn, a c pawn, for a center pawn. And black takes back with a pawn. So we get this kind of structure we might have gotten earlier. And this very much resembles a typical position in this Tartakower variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. And then I just take here. And he has a choice. He can take with the pawn. This is, I'm fairly familiar with this variation from the white side because I have an opponent at my local chess club who always likes to play the Tartakower variation. And we've reached similar kinds of positions a lot of times. And he often goes for this setup with the hanging pawns. It's a very dynamic setup. The pawns can come under fire, but they can also push forward to disrupt white's pawn structure. And black has good piece play. So it's a very interesting way of playing. In this particular case, maybe I can, with a move like knight to a4, maybe I can start to put some pressure on the pawns. I mean, that's the thing about the hanging pawns, is they can come under fire. So I guess there's a bit of a threat to trade off this knight and grab the pawn, or even just take it directly. But well, he can defend with the rook. So anyway, that's how in play might continue. He chose to take with the knight, which is interesting too. This gives him some good active knights and an isolated queen's pawn. But as you all know, the isolated queen's pawn is kind of a double-edged thing to have in your position, a double-edged feature of your position. It can be a nice tool in the endgame to push forward, open things up, and he's got this bishop behind it ready to spring into life. But it can also be a weakness because it's isolated, and something that white can play for an endgame where he tries to win that isolated pawn and get a pawn up endgame. Anyway, after the immediate exchange, the knight is hitting my bishop, so I dropped it back to b1. He plays rook f to d8. I play knight to e2. And he goes rook a to c8. So I would say black's play has been very solid so far. He's got quite a good position. I think my position is okay as well. And one thing I will mention at this point is he was really taking his time and thinking about every move, which eventually started to catch up with him. But we're not at that point. I wanted to also mention this knight e2 move. As soon as I had a free move, I mean this. We just got the isolated queen spawn. His knight is hitting my bishop, so I have to respond to that. But then he played this rook move. And so this is my earliest opportunity to maneuver the knight. And this, what you want to do when playing against the isolated queen's pawn is first make sure that it can't come forward. So you want to securely blockade it while you organize your pieces to later attack. So the Nimzovich mantra was restrain, blockade, and destroy. And so that's the procedure I'm following here. So this knight e2 move is part of that restrain operation. Just keep that from coming forward. Plays rook a to c8, and I play knight e to d4. Now it's securely blockaded, and as I said, I can arrange my pieces to my content, and then when I've got everything set up to put the maximum pressure on the pawn, I can move this knight away and unveil an attack along the d file. That's one way of playing this. He played the interesting move g6 here. I don't know that was really the strongest move here, but it does a couple of good things. It takes these squares away from my knight. My knight might have been thinking of hopping into the f5 square. It also blunts any potential attacks along this diagonal. I mean, I have the ability, the way things are set up now, I had the ability to try and go for some kind of lineup with the bishop and the queen against the h-pawn, but now he's blunted all that. So it's, I think, a good defensive move. I decided to kick this knight off of this good square. He dropped the knight back to e6. Now this pawn is under attack, so I have to defend it. And here he decided to exchange. So I'm happy to see these exchanges. And normally I would just take back with the knight, but I saw this this diagonal here, this open diagonal, and I decided taking back with the queen looks pretty good. Maybe I can maneuver this knight around. Say the knight comes like this. If I can hop the knight into the f6 square, I can create some serious threats against his king with the queen on this diagonal and those open dark squares, those weak dark squares. So I decided to take with the queen. Anyway, what I was starting to say is that trades generally favor white in this position, particularly trades of the minor pieces. The ideal endgame for white is getting rid of all the minor pieces and just having a heavy piece endgame with rooks and queen, and that's it's the easiest for white to maximize the pressure on that pawn. So I was happy to see that trade. You can't always avoid trading the rooks, though, and we'll see that happen in the game. I don't think they all get traded here. Let's just see what happens. He offers the queen trade here, and I wasn't quite ready to take the queen. I was just, but I wasn't averse to him taking the queen either. I thought, well, I'm not going to move my queen away and have it move to a worse square. I'll just leave it there and try and put my bishop on a good square. So move the bishop out to where it's now attacking. It was not really hitting anything along this diagonal. Maybe a little pressure on the knight, but now I can hit this isolated queen's pawn. I'm starting to get some pressure on it. He goes for the trade, and I take back with the knight, of course, keeping his pawn isolated. And then he played a6. So that's kind of an interesting move. It's keeping my knight. Let's back that up. Keeping my knight out of the b5 square. Maybe he wants to play pawn to b5 at some point, but that's pawn to b5 is a double-edged move. It gives him better control over this c4 square. He's got pretty good control anyway, however, and it gives up the c5 square. So probably keeping the pawns here would be black's best strategy. He did have an option here. The chess engine kind of likes this move, knight to c3. And I was calculating this line as well, because I always have to worry about this fork happening here. But my knight is protecting against that fork, and it's also in a position where it can't easily be traded away. So this knight comes in here with tempo, but after bishop to b3, I don't know if it has any great follow-up. It seems like this is still okay for me. So anyway, he went a6, and now I chose to kick the knight. He went f3, and at this point, he probably should just drop his knight back to d6. That's not a bad square for the knight, and it's looking in at this c4 square where the knight ends up eventually, but he could get there quicker by that route. But I'm thinking if we count the material on the board, it's almost to the point where there's it's almost to the point where the king can join in the game. It's an endgame, and there's 16 points of material. And the rule of 14 says that if there's less than 14 points of material, then the king is safe to come out. But you want to sort of prepare for that. So f3 also gives the king a way into the game. Anyway, he played the interesting move here, knight to d2. And so I think this is the point at which black's game starts to go downhill. He's been playing cautiously and carefully to this point, but this knight maneuver did not work out for him. So I started by harassing his knight. If he trades rooks, I mean, that's one way out of it. But then, well, I have pretty good control over the c file after that, and my king can join in the game quite easily. After the rook trade too, I don't have to worry about the force on the board. I'll be satisfied. The rule of 14 will be satisfied. So he moved his knight, went to this c4 square, which is good. But I doubled my rooks here, or prepared to double them. I'm thinking maybe I can just trade this off and win a pawn on this square. And if he tries to defend, that does open up a square for my knight. That's one idea. And another idea I have is really just to push the a pawn forward and win a pawn on b5. If he tries to defend it or hold it there, and then if he takes, then this knight gets loosened up, and I can put the pressure on the knight and maybe win that pawn. So so he's got to react to this. After I played rook c3, he played knight b2. An interesting tactical maneuver. It looks like it's a double attack. Well, it is a double attack. He's attacking this rook, and he's attacking this rook. But I have a decent defense in rook d to c1. So he went ahead and traded, and yeah, now it's definitely time for me to think about getting my king into the game. He went rook to d7. I was also thinking about bringing my rook to the 7th rank. This would be quite a good square for my rook as well. So he blocked that. If he had blocked in the other direction, if he had put his rook here, I could just trade rooks and take that pawn. So he has to block from this direction. And now I start bringing my king over. The one thing I want to watch out for is any sort of tactical tricks. So king f2, for example, runs into the fork. So still have to be careful when this knight, I mean, it looks like the knight is a little bit out of play, and and he's given up the c file. So I should have a pretty solid advantage positionally here. But you still have to be wary of those tactical tricks. And now we're on move 27 here, so we're getting, the time control is at move 40, so we're getting closer to that. Let's see, he played knight a4 here, trying to get his knight back into the game. I mean, in the long run, I could have just, if he didn't try and save the knight somehow, I could have just walked my king over and trapped it. It didn't have many good moves over there. So I dropped my rook back to c2, and so these squares are covered, and this square is covered. So the knight really has no moves there. So I was going to play bishop to b3 next and force him to defend the knight or move it. So he preempted that. He played b5, so now his knight has a way out from that square. But at the same time, as I mentioned, that was a double-edged move because it gave up control of this c5 square, and I can look forward to sinking a piece on that square. But in the meantime, I still want to activate my king. I played king e2. He started bringing his king over, king f8. Go bishop b3 now. And really, if he doesn't move the knight, I'm just going to take it. After the exchange, I'll try and get my knight to this square and fork those two pieces. Although, maybe it's not so obvious how I get there, but I'm pretty sure those pawns are going to be weak over there. So I'm looking forward to taking off that knight. So he drops it back to b6. Also, he's got a good square for his knight. He's looking forward to putting his knight onto the c4 square. So I keep marching my king into the center. He brings his king up to e7. So very logical endgame play so far. And now I start an interesting knight maneuver. I go with knight to e2. I'm getting the knight out of the way so that my king can take up the blockading square here. The king is a great blockader in the endgame because not only does it blockade the pawn, but it attacks it at the same time. And I'm just trying to organize my forces to get all four pieces attacking that pawn. And it's pretty hard to stop. It's already under attack from the bishop. The king comes forward to attack it. The knight goes here to attack it, and the rook goes here to attack it. And I've got all four of my pieces trained on it. So it's happening very fast. Let's see, he played king d6. And at this point, I would say the time trouble was becoming noticeable. We're on move 32. You had to make 40 moves in 2 hours. That was the time control. And I still had half an hour left. That's about how I like to divide my time up, a half an hour for each set of 10 moves in a 2-hour time period like that. And he was down to about 10 minutes here. So he's starting to be a little bit rushed. Let's see, I played king d4, and he went rook c7, offering the trade. The chess engine actually likes the trade, thinks I should just take it and then just play on. But I didn't see how I could win the pawn. I thought he was pretty well organized here to defend that pawn. I didn't want to give up the c file, so I thought for a while here. I still had time to think. And I came up with what I think is a good move, although the chess engine still thinks I should just take. But I thought this was nice because it prevents him from taking my rook. If he takes my rook, I take back with the pawn, and that's a fork of those two pieces. So at least for the moment, the rook can't be taken. But he played knight c4, and after this, I couldn't find anything better than just exchanging off that rook. I need to do something a little bit quickly because he is attacking the a pawn, and I have to deal with that. Let's see. Yeah, I don't have an alternative here that for the chess engine, so I guess this was fine to take at this point. So I did end up exchanging rooks after all. He takes back, and then I play a4. And yeah, here's where the computer had an alternative. It's kind of interesting. The computer would first play knight to c3. I guess the idea is I'm threatening to take that pawn, so it'd be a trade. He could grab this pawn, and I could grab this pawn. But I guess this would be an endgame where I have this one pawn holding back two pawns. Say if I'm left with a pawn here, that one pawn can hold back two pawns, and this pawn will be gone, and I'll have a majority of 4 versus 3 on this side of the board. So that might be a winning endgame for me as well. Anyway, I just pushed on with a4. I thought that was kind of reasonable. He went king d6. The way the chess engine thinks that black can equalize here, it thinks black is still holding on, is to take and then play a5. And this it is true that this presents me with some problems. I mean, if I just take it, seems like this position is dissolving. The pawns are all on one side of the board to make black's defense a little bit easier. Yeah, I don't know if I can get enough force together to round up that d pawn there. So I mean, the other way to play it is to push this pawn forward, but then his king can come over and blockade it. My bishop is tied down defending the pawn. It's not clear if I can make progress that way either. So I guess I would go for the exchange and just try to keep playing on. I mean, it's not, after taking, knight takes a5, it's not like it's an easy draw for black. So it's the kind of position I can play on for a long time and poke and prod and see if I can provoke some weaknesses. But anyway, the chess engine thinks black can defend that position, and it rates this move king d6 as the start of black's decline. And now we're in move 36, so he really has almost no time at all. He's down to about I think a couple of minutes to make the next 4 moves. So all this went by pretty quickly. I pushed on with a5. I could have taken, but I wanted to keep as many pawns on the game as I could, and this does take a square away from his knight, so it has some utility. He went bishop to c8. He's thinking of repositioning his bishop over here to the king side. I think maybe this plan was not particularly well thought out, and maybe that's a symptom of his lack of time to really think about it. And now I continue my knight maneuver. I had started my knight maneuver quite a while ago, putting the knight on this square. I continue with knight to c1. I played bishop to e6, and I go knight to d3, and now you can see where the knight is heading. It's heading for this c5 square that I mentioned, and now it's just going to win some material, and there's no way of avoiding material loss. He played f6, so that controls some squares around his king here. But I hop in with knight c5. I can defend the pawn for the moment with bishop to c8. But well, and we made the time control, but this was move 40, and now it's my turn. If you want to look at this position and see what's the best move for white here. Yeah, I think it's an interesting kind of endgame position to look at. I'm going to give the answer away, so pause the video if you want some time to think about it. The move I played is e4, and I think it's the best move here. Well, he took, and so we'll see what happens. The chess engine gives the best move for black here as f5. And then, of course, that kind of forces me to take. So I'm just going to go a pawn up, and he still has to worry about this knight here getting exchanged, and I can win another pawn on c4 there, so he's probably got to move his knight away next. So this looks like I'm just winning in this endgame, a pawn up. Maybe it's because the chess engine likes it because his king is in such a good position blockading my pawn. Maybe it can try and resist it, but it still gives an advantage to white in that position. Anyway, he took, which is maybe the more natural move, but now this is how he loses a pawn. I take with check, and the king has to move. Doesn't matter where it goes because I take the knight off next, and he cannot defend everything. He's going to lose that pawn on c4. And this is actually much worse than just a pawn. It's these pawns over here on the queen side are far advanced, and his king is on the wrong side of the board. So this actually is a pretty straightforward win from this point. So, although I was playing very carefully based on my experience from the previous game. So, but I think this is a win that I can convert. So let's see. It's black's turn to move. He played king e5. He's going for counterplay. I mean, he could. The other choice for black is to try and, well, he can't come to this square or this square, but he could try to come around this way and defend on this side. But if his king wanders over to this side of the board, I can also, well, the problem is this pawn is hanging, so I guess he would need to push the pawn first and then move his king. Anyway, it's he goes for counterplay with bringing the king forward. And so I go for play on this side of the board. He just continues marching forward with his king, and I continue marching forward with my king. Now I've got pressure on this pawn, which is still defended by the bishop, but my knight is coming in. He marches, he kicks my knight. Yeah, so maybe he should have played that move a little sooner. And now he's going after these pawns on the queen side. So, if you just count material, it may look like black is in okay shape because I gave up these pawns on purpose on the queen side here. But my pawns over here, I'm giving up these kingside pawns, but my pawns on the queen side are closer to queening. Now, this has to be calculated very precisely. It does get a bit complicated still. So let's follow how it goes. I grab the pawn. He doesn't trade. He keeps his bishop on because he wants to, kind of slow down the march of my pawns to the maximum extent possible. So I get my knight out of the way so I can get my knight out of the way so that I can move these pawns forward. And he starts chewing up these pawns over here on the king side. I push my pawn forward. Now he has to take, and I take back. I take with the king because I want to get my king out of the way of this pawn. Let's see. He brings his king forward. He grabs another pawn, and I push my pawn forward. He steps aside with his king, and I just keep pushing my pawn forward. And now at this point, I do have to pause from my rampage. Well, I don't have to pause here. I could push it one more step forward, but I thought I would bring the knight over here because I have to be prepared to trade the knight for this pawn, and then I will get the queen. So he pushes on with f3. I play b7, and he goes f2. And now at this point, the knight comes in with check. And I had found this clever knight maneuver a few moves back as I was calculating this position. He attacks the knight goes in front of the pawn, he attacks it again, and now the knight goes over here to g3. So this buys me a tempo. The knight is secure on this square. He doesn't want to give up that pawn by pushing it forward. Best he can do is take this pawn, and now I get to queen, and my queen defends my knight. So that's the key idea here. Let's see, he moves his king out of the way of any discovered checks there. I bring my queen in. He played g5, but I just went ahead and took it. Let's see, he played on, so I guess I will play this out. But this is clearly a win at this point. After he went king takes f1, I went queen h6. And just put my queen in front of that pawn, so there's no defending it, and I'm going to take it the next move. He didn't resign here, though. Let's see. He played on until I chased his king all the way to the back rank. So we can just step forward to that point. And when I put my queen on f2, then he finally resigned. So anyway, that was another long game. Had 2 long games this day, but at least this one finished with a win for me. So fun game, and stay tuned for what happened in round 5. I will see you then.